We're now live on YouTube, Chair.
Perfect. Thanks, Raj. Welcome to this meeting of the 12th of December of Northamptonshire Schools Forum. I'll go to Raj just first of all. Have we had any apologies for non-attendance, please, Raj?
Yeah, we've received apologies from Angela Podger, James Sherlock, and Robert Type.
Great. Thank you. Just nod if perfect. Forum membership.
There are no changes to the membership on this occasion.
Great, thanks. And any forum members that would like to declare a declaration of interest in the current agenda? No, perfect. Hi, I see Therese just joined us. Sorry, Sandra, over to you.
Apologies, I think I might have mentioned this before, and I'm not sure it is actually relevant, but my school has plans for a SEND unit. So we're one of the new builds, so I don't know if that's going to impact. I doubt it does from what I've seen.
That's a good point, Sandra, because I have in which case I would have a similar conflict of interest to declare that, because that's true for one of our schools as well, has an interest in a new SEND unit. Is there anyone else that applies to, or just on the basis that it's probably better to declare an interest rather than not?
Yeah.
Paul, yeah.
Yeah.
Same for Paul. It's probably better to log those than not, and we can take advice for future meetings on that. Perfect. Great. So I shall move on to item 2, which are the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of October 2024. First thing is, do any forum members have any comments on the accuracy of those minutes? So again, can you just nod if you're happy to accept those as a true and accurate record of the meeting? Perfect. That's great. And I think probably we have most items covered on the on this agenda, but are there any items from the previous minutes that either forum members or officers would like to comment on? No, I shall take silence as a no. So we'll move on swiftly to item number 3, which is our DSG update, and I'll hand over to Soraya for this item.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm bringing this report to School Forum to update them on the current position of the DSG grant. This is the position to quarter 2 for 24-25. Coming down to section 3 of the report, the DSG grant for 24-25 amounted to 388.4 million. This was adjusted and agreed at full council to include a budget deficit of 7.7 million for the high needs block. In the March allocation, the early years budget was increased by 792k. A further adjustment's been done in July, where the early years budget was decreased by 174k, and the high needs block budget was also decreased by 107k. Forecast outturn at quarter 2 is a pressure of 9.639 million, resulting in an overall deficit of 17.3 million. The table in section 3 breaks that down for you. Moving on to section 4 of the report, the outturn for 23-24 carried forward a deficit of 6.8 million, and taking that into account, the forecasted cumulative deficit at the end of the year will be 24.2 million, and that's broken down under section 4.1 of the report. The main pressures have been grouped together into 5 main areas, and these are all summarised under section 4.4. Section 4.12 details the work that is taking place within the service to help mitigate those pressures over the next year, but that'll be discussed a bit further on under the high needs block paper. And then Appendix 8 attached to the report breaks down the spend to cost centre level, and School Forum are asked to note this report. I'll open up to any questions if anyone's got any.
Yeah, Paul.
Hi, thanks, Sarai. Can I ask, against the cumulative deficit, the 24 million, do you have an analysis of that by block? I mean, I can see obviously there's the analysis by block of the of the 9.6, but variance there. But do you have something that sets out which blocks the 24 million's in? Because there are obviously going to be some that are, if you like, in surplus, and obviously high needs is going to remain in deficit.
Yeah, so the 6.8 that was brought forward from 23-24 is where most of that sat under the high needs block, and that was part of our outturn that we brought forward in, I think we brought it to the July meeting, which kind of listed what blocks it was in. But I can bring it to the next forum meeting if you want me to, kind of just bring another paper which kind of breaks that 6.8 down again.
I think it's just useful to see what the cumulative is by block.
Yeah.
And the reason I have concerns around that is that looking at it on the face of this, early years block is subsidising the deficit on high needs, and I suspect that when you look at the 6.8, that will be a similar position. There will be a much bigger deficit on high needs that's been offset by other blocks. And I think it's useful to see that, because it is the early years. I know we've got papers around that, but the early years are areas that are really struggling for funding. They're part of the sector that's got the most strain, and so that having that offsetting or subsidising high needs isn't a good place to be. So that's why I think it's useful for members to see the whole picture of the 24 million.
That's fine. I'll continue that to the next meeting.
Thank you.
So any other questions or comments? That item. Thanks ever so much then, Soraya, for that. And then we'll go over to Salik for item 4, which is the 24-25 schools monitoring. Oh, sorry, I can see, I think that's Lisa with a hand up. Sorry, Lisa, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I just have to agree, because I'm in the early years block, and we do struggle a lot for funding. So the fact that it's been used to hold up the high needs funding does bother me too. So I'm just agreeing with Paul. I do find that very concerning.
Yeah, Salik, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I bring forth the schools Q2 monitoring for 24-25. This is based on April to September 24. It was agreed previously in Jan 23 in school forum. Schools will submit monthly monitoring data to Northamptonshire, and based on that information derived from ERP, we have compiled table 2, which highlights the number of schools and the expenditure split between pay, premises and supplies and services. As at Q2, total of 9 schools that were identified being in deficit. Some of them have a larger deficit than others. Of those were the 4 schools that we're currently working with in terms of getting them through the license deficit process. Last week at the Northamptonshire, we discussed the initial terms of reference for the panel, and that will take place in early January. The current support for schools that have been identified in deficit, we're trying to work with them in order to give them strategic guidance, how to address specific challenge, and work with service leads within Northamptonshire where those challenges lie within those schools. So, for example, if the challenges then lies with some of the SEND funding that they're not receiving, or in terms of structural issues that they have, so we're liaising with school effectiveness to sort those issues out at the moment. The recommendation for school forum is just to note this current position, and hopefully we'll bring Q3 monitoring in January. If there's any questions.
Thanks, Salik. Andrew.
Thanks, James, and thank you for that briefing. It's very concise. Just one question. We talked previously about the need for earlier and earlier diagnostics for schools. So that's my first question about how we are progressing with moving the diagnostics further upstream to try and avoid these deficit problems in the first place, notwithstanding that schools are facing huge pressures. The second question is, to what extent are these the support being given to the school about managing the budget internally, as opposed to proposing alternative structures that might make that school part of other structures, whether that's academy, federation, whatever. Are we still just trying to solve budgets within budgets, as it were?
So the initial review that we do when once a school has some concerns, obviously schools are heading towards a deficit, is Catherine from school's sports team goes into that schools and helps them work through their budgets to analyze what could be stopped or what is going wrong. We do offer seminars that those are done termly to schools to update them in terms of to have a early indication of what their grants would look like, and we issue those guidances out to them, and they can build those into the budgets. Currently, within Q2 monitoring, from what I can see, is they've had a CSPG go into their budgets, which was released later on in September. Another variance that we might see is some of the schools might not have had their teachers' pay backdated. TPAG only came out later on in October, so those will issue those sort those issues out in early Q3.
Okay.
But in terms of early diagnostics, you are right, we are currently working on that because we need to streamline those processes and get early intervention in. In terms of Fran, do you want to come in around school structures and managing those deficits?
Yeah, it's probably one for Fran there, I think, to just talk about what the kind of, I guess, the more strategic level thought is on how the local authority can work with schools. So yeah, Fran, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So, and thank you, Salik, who has done a huge amount of work in this area. But I think it's safe to say that it's been a very finance-led agenda up until this point, in terms of making sure that Catherine, who is within the school finance team, it works very, very closely with our maintained schools. And we do actually, benchmarking wise, have a low number of schools operating within a licence deficit. However, we know, don't we, that the national picture is that is likely to increase. So we've met recently to plan a more strategic way to support schools, and from an earlier intervention perspective, but also for those schools who are in licence deficit, and we need to support them in order to implement a plan. And really, we've talked about the fact that aside from the financial issues that we can't address, i.e. the funding formula, i.e. the things that are set at central government that we have little ability to impact, there are things that we can put in place for schools to enable them, depending on the reasons why they're in deficit. So we've assessed all the schools that are currently operating in licence deficit, and then the finance team also hold the full list, as you would expect, so we can see those that might be headed in that direction as well. And with the intel that's in the system at the moment, just done a bit of an overview as to why that might be. Perhaps it's due to falling roles, perhaps it's due to, particularly for some primary schools, perhaps it's due to just the organisational structure that sits within the school that's not kept up with the numbers of pupils on roll. We have one school, and we've worked closely with them this half term, where it's actually the sporadic nature of the admissions of the children that are affecting, because they're not really too sure how many children they'll get on any given kind of term. Then there's often, and there are obviously instances as well, where there are leadership and governance issues that we need to support schools to work through. So on the basis of there being different themes, what we're doing is wrapping the wider education structure around finance now, to make sure that depending on the reasons, we have the right people. So we've got Marsha with us, who leads our your access and sufficiency team. So where there is need for consideration of different changes of PAN, or potentially different staffing structures, we can work with schools in a more proactive way to consider how that might be done. So we're trialling it with a few schools at the moment, where, as I said, those that are kind of reaching the top of that list. But from January, we want to be in a position where we can start operating the panels that have been discussed about. And what we're really keen to do is that there's head teacher representation on those panels, or perhaps school forum members representation on those panels, because you know best how it feels to run your schools with the funding formula that we have. So it's a question of us being able to provide that leadership from the local authority, but also that peer support as well. Just to make sure that I think heads in those spaces feel supported. And I think one thing I'm also saying to lots of head teachers, and I know Andrew, you'll agree, but it feels very isolating. I think sometimes I can imagine when you're in a school that's operating in that space, but actually opening up the conversation to say this is a national problem. We have many schools across, not just across this region, but nationally, that are operating in this space. I think head teachers have fed back that kind of takes the pressure off a little bit, because often I think it feels like you're doing something wrong because you're in this position. It's often a combination of things. So we are moving in the right direction. We're not there yet, Andrew. We need next term, we're going to be starting to implement some of the things that we're talking about. And I'd be really keen to hear from the feedback from the schools that are in the top 7, just to see if they found that helpful. Obviously, they're going to say, as I would say, I wish we would have had this 3 years ago. It would have been even more helpful, but we are where we are. And then very, very much swiftly focusing on, as schools begin to set budgets, where are the schools that we need to quickly wrap our support around throughout spring term 1 and spring term 2, to make sure that we can support those conversations earlier rather than later.
Okay, thank you both. That was really helpful.
Thank you. Paul.
Thanks, James. Just a question, a note and then a question for me. That there's obviously, as we have been seeing, a decline in forecast balances across most of the organisations, and obviously some of them going into deficit. You mentioned the TPAG grant. Do you know if some of the schools haven't incorporated that, or the new schools core schools budget grant? Do you know if all the schools have built those into their forecast, or is that perhaps why some of them have got a more pessimistic picture because they haven't recognised that income in at the present time?
I'd say if, the CSBG grant for predominantly most of the schools has gone in. I can't say 100% for TPAG, as I believe that was later on this year. That was the allocations have come out for those, but they will definitely go through in our December monitoring in Q3, because that will counteract the back pay for teachers that have gone through.
So there might be some improvement as a result of that once it washes through in the at the next meeting, let's say. Thank you.
Thanks. Catherine.
Hi. I just wondered if, as part of that package you were talking about, Fran, whether heads and business managers are able to kind of work together. I mean, I'm not necessarily very helpful in terms of, because my situation is different, but two kind of primary schools in a similar area, one in a deficit, one not. Is that a collaboration? We collaborate on lots of sort of teaching and learning things. I just wondered if business managers are able to do that too.
I think it's the head teacher, it's the business manager, and also the chair of governors, the 3 kind of most key members that we would want to be involved in. And you're absolutely right. Once we and as we start to group schools into the themes, that's when you start to get your peer support as well, and that's where you start to think you share good practice, but also potentially where schools are looking at things like federation, there becomes to be more obvious solutions to some of the issues. But yeah, absolutely, it wouldn't just be the head teacher.
Thanks ever so much. Great, we'll conclude that item. And for items 5 and 6, we've taken a call actually just to swap these around from the published agenda, largely because we're going to invite Charisse just to give that presentation as promised during last forum on some of the slightly longer term strategy around high needs and the budget. But I kind of I guess a bit of a foreshadowing of a new way of looking at that. And we thought probably the best thing is to see the presentation, ask any questions we have of Charisse before we progress on to actually look at the potential transfer between blocks. So I hope that seems sensible to forum members. It just seemed a slightly odd thing to us to do it the other way round. So yeah, I shall invite Charisse now to present.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Really good to be here and be able to sort of articulate what some of the long-term early help strategies are, I just wondered if there was a potential for Raj to share the presentation so that I can see it on screen. I'm not sure if it's there at the moment, but thank you, Chair. I'd like to go through. It's just a couple of slides that just sort of sets out where we are now and where we would like to get to. So one of the things that I've heard this afternoon, which really chimes in with this presentation, is really about the mobilisation and really driving forward a powerful early help offer. But before I get there, I just wanted to sort of contextualise where we are at the moment and why solutions around early help are so imperative. So colleagues will know that over the last few years, we've had a substantive surge in our education healthcare plans, which is largely for multifactorial reasons. We've had increased population and migration growth, which has led to the demand rising to around 4,200 education healthcare plans, with a projected rise double by 2028. So that really is painting a picture of growth in need, growth in complexity, and growth in demand. What we know is that increased level of need has led to an increased number of children requiring that more specialist independent sector provision, and therefore, as a result of that, subsequently has had an impact on our high needs block pressures and deficit. And one thing I want to note is this is a widespread national challenge. Many local authorities and councils are confronted by the same combination of complexity, increased demand in need and provision. And I think it's a joint view that the change in trajectory, there needs to be more radical solutions locally, but also at that national level, those solutions to funding and framework. But in NNC, we're in a really exciting period of transition, and our overarching vision is about how we can deliver that effective early help and inclusive support that is right at the front door of our communities. And our schools are vital to that. So our ambition is around that stronger families, stronger communities, and stronger schools. And to deliver that strategy, there are a number of things that we have underway. And I just wanted to articulate some of the immediate action that we've undertaken. And as the chair said, some of the more longitudinal strategies that we have in place. So the first is around having that really clear high needs block strategy and programme, which is in place. And parallel to that, we've also developed a dedicated unit of multi-agency professionals that are going to provide that team around DSG. And that's working really closely with our data, our finance, and that's really driving the operational delivery of those strategies and plans into action. As part of our immediate as well, we are doing a comprehensive deep dive to look at who is our cohort within independent sector provision, so that we really have a really clear idea as to who our young people are, but also so that we can support them post 16. But I think having that comprehensive deep dive will be able to ascertain some of the patterns and some of the trends, but also some of the areas of commissioning development around some of the support that we need to offer earlier on. So in terms of our long term, and this is a really exciting opportunity for us to reset, reshape our early help offer, as I said, galvanised around the stronger families, stronger schools, stronger communities. And we are planning to pioneer the development of a multidimensional team around the school early help offer that will be locality based and will be deployed through multidisciplinary squads being based in mainstream schools. And the idea is that we will provide 5 pillars of intervention. And I'm just going to summarise these with a little bit more detail on the next slides. So within those multidisciplinary teams and squads will be education early help navigators. We recognise the fundamental importance of that early diagnostic identification, providing that wraparound support really early. Second, send and inclusion navigators. We know that having that inclusive wraparound support is also crucial for some of our children experiencing that complexity. We believe that a strong therapeutic component that can provide that wraparound care and therapy for children and young people, both within school and in the home, is vital. And the two other areas is around driving forward that trauma-informed practice training across all of our schools, and then connecting those dots is a digital solution that enables us to ensure that we're able to track and monitor children's progress, but also the opportunity for parents to be engaged in that. And one of the areas of systemic change is we want to widen our school inclusion offer. So I'm just going to explain the pillars in a little bit more detail on the next slide, so that it encapsulates the menu that is going to be available. So as I said, those education early help navigators will be supporting our children that have SEMH, elective home education, often with some of those areas that we know can be generated through family dysfunction or distress. And the idea is the early help navigator will be working in those schools to provide that think family approach, coordinated through those early help assessments and creating that wraparound team around the child so the right support is received at the right time. Our send and inclusion navigators will provide that support at the earliest opportunity, pre-EHCP and also post-EHCP, where there are cognition and learning support for children who are at risk of exclusion, but also supporting them through bespoke packages of care. And again, the navigators will be based within our school environments. And the idea is that we will have those service level agreements in place so that we're really clear as to what support is going to be available and how we can offer that support. Our Elevate therapeutic practitioners will be multidisciplinary team. And this is a really important element because from having conversations with schools, certainly with parents, one of the areas is around emotionally based school refusal, anxiety, but also equally children with SEMH and at risk of exclusion. And we want to be able to create a wraparound therapeutic offer that provides therapy wherever you are. So lots of conventional therapeutic approaches is reliant on children and families coming to you. This is about us coming to you in terms of your home or mainstream settings. And this is about providing that additional therapeutic support. We recognise that supporting children with a range of complexity is about providing schools with that training and support around trauma-informed practice. And we want to be able to roll out a phased training programme for those schools that are interested around trauma-informed practice, because we want to foster that greater environment of inclusion and belonging, and creating those trauma-informed communities is also vital. And as I said, on the far right is really thinking about the technological benefits and innovations that digital and AI solutions can support and enhance accessibility for children and young people. And we're exploring the development of that digital solution that can support children to engage with that support, but also supporting parents and have that inbuilt chat function with navigators, but also there are early warning signs when things may be going not as well as we want, and we can be able to then, recourse back and sort of provide that support for children and families. So this is the 5-pillar overview of support. The idea is that we are reshaping our internal resources to be able to deliver this. We feel that this is a maximised opportunity to really build that relationship with schools, but also be able to designate and deploy support through small teams that will be based in schools at that earlier point. And if we just move on to the next couple of slides, this just gives you a kind of articulated vision of that graduated response, that flexible early help support, right support at the right time through those multidisciplinary squads, thinking through how we're responding to needs. So one of the key things that we will be looking at is demography across our school data sets, so that we're making sure that we're aligning the resource with the support where there's schools with high prevalence of need, so that we're not missing anything out. And then, as I said, you know, that enhancement around flexibility and choice is also incredibly important. And one of the things that we are hoping with this model is that we will start to reduce some of that high escalative need that we've seen and also intervene at a much earlier stage. So just in terms of our approach, in terms of how we are planning to work with our schools, we recognise that this is our kind of high level articulation of what we want to offer. Raji, we can move to the next slide. But the idea is that we want to be able to roll out some of those co-design workshops so that we can test this out. We can road test the model with our schools, with our children, parents and families, with our wider partnerships, because the fundamental importance for us is that we get this right first time, but also that we hear and surface that wisdom and power. You know, how great is that we kind of, you know, construct this model that we think is going to be beneficial and is going to have impact, but we want to be able to have an iterative process where we work in collaboration with our schools. So we are planning to launch those co-design workshops and sessions towards the end of January, and dates for that will come out shortly. And then finally, just the timeline that we are working to. We are on a designated time trajectory. We recognise the importance of this approach. And so I just wanted to populate some key milestone dates for colleagues to just note so that you're clear in terms of our pathway of what we want to achieve. So Raja, we just move on to the next slide. That will be great. So I've just articulated a few of the touch points as to where we are in terms of what has been delivered so far. But as you can see, sort of from December to April is where we are looking to refresh our support offer for schools, looking at our current resourcing plan, but then implementing those design workshops towards the end of Jan. And then we're looking at a turnaround for our business case to go through to the executive, start those onboarding sessions with schools, and the anticipated launch is to go through our first phase from April 25. So we're looking at that timeline so that we're able to deliver that support for schools, which we know is very much needed. And I'm just going to pause there because it would be good to have some dialogue or some questions and queries on thoughts from the forum about the approach that we are proposing around early help.
Thanks ever so much, Sharice. That's really, really clear. Lisa, I think I can see with a hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Sharice, for explaining that. I think they were very good and the slides are very clear as well. I'm just wondering, with the early years block, I can see that there's a lot of talk about services within schools. What about independent providers and voluntary groups, charity groups? How are they going to be able to access these if they're within schools?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we will be looking at is that flexibility in terms of coverage of the offer. I spoke about school support, but that's something that we can think about in terms of that wider co-design workshops that we're planning in January about where else can we support other areas of the system so that we can ensure that this is an inclusive offer and that we can widen that participation and accessibility out. So it would be great to have you at those co-design workshops, helping us to think through collectively. My approach and ambition is very much around a whole system early help approach. We also recognise the currency and assets of our voluntary sector as well. And I think that if we think about a life course for a child, you know, from 0 to 25, there are critical junctures and transitions. And as I said before, we want to get it right. So having your voice and your feedback and your insights to make sure that we've got a widespread early help accessible offer for all will be fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Marie.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sharice. They all sound like brilliant ideas, really kind of creative and solution focused, which is good to hear that there's sort of different ideas coming out to solve what we all know is a huge problem. Just some kind of questions on the logistics, I guess. how are you planning to kind of recruit and retain staff? Because I think one of the biggest barriers we face is the churn of staff, particularly EHC case officers. And we end up with case officers that don't know a school's context, that are allocating, a 7th EHCP request for a reception child, not knowing that there are 6 already in the school. So how are we going to recruit and retain high quality staff that schools can get to know? And then in terms of physical space, where will these people be based within a school? Because most schools don't have spare offices and rooms to do this kind of work. It was great when there were children's centres and we had access to that, but we don't anymore. So just on a practical level, where will they be based? And if new builds are needed, what's kind of a timeline for this actually having an impact on children and families and helping schools?
Yeah, Marie, I think those are 2 excellent questions. Thank you. I think, as you said, to drive something of this quality, to have the level of impact, to support the delivery of the outcomes that we've anticipated and we want for our children and young people, having that skilled, dynamic workforce is going to be absolutely crucial. And you spoke about retention and sustainability of the workforce. One of the key things that we are committed to is about workforce development and workforce practice transformation. So alongside the model delivery, we will also be investing in staff, our own internal staff, who I think are a great asset to us. So there will be a workforce development programme for them to undergo to widen their skills capacity. But also as part of our recruitment drive, we are out at the moment to recruit permanent education, healthcare, permanent EHC caseworkers. They will also be part of our offer too. So I think workforce development, practice skills development is really crucial. I think it's really important that any new workers that come in have a really extensive induction in terms of understanding the legacy and the context of our schools. One of the things that we want to be able to do as part of this model is to do onboarding days so that we get an opportunity for staff to be able to meet with schools, acclimatise, understand that school community. So there will be a multifaceted plan, one that dedicates on workforce development and sustainability. The second is about onboarding so that we can build that culture of partnership and integration. And the third, in terms of sustainability, we are working really hard at the moment to ensure that NNC is one of the best places to work. And very shortly, there will be a campaign that's coming out about some of the great things that we are accomplishing on our transformational journey. And therefore, I believe that is going to be attracting talent into Northamptonshire. So those are some of the strategies that we're going to do. In terms of logistics, again, fantastic question. You'll know that we have our family hubs developments. Those are very key cornerstones within our local community. We've got 2 that went live in Wellingborough, and also we've got 1 in Kettering. We've got 2 coming on stream by March 2025. So we will have 4 family hub networks. And the whole idea and the ethos behind this model is that they have agility and flexibility. We want them rooted in local communities. This is where children and families are. We want them at the front door of those communities. We want to create those inclusion and early help ecosystems. So what we see is a flexible model that they will be working from existing infrastructures, which are our family hubs, which are great spaces and have great opportunities for that flexible working. And we also will be having those onboarding conversations with schools about where there is space available, on what days, and we'll be able to work that flexibly. But we see that their base will be from family hubs, working on rotation in those schools if they have space available. And just to your point about sufficiency, we do have a whole plan around how do we create inclusion and wellbeing units within our existing assets. And that's something that we're working on as part of our new early help service offer, is reconceptualizing how we build wellbeing units within our existing assets, and we're hoping that some of those will be able to come on stream by September 25. So that will be another option of where our navigators will be based. So this is very much a locality, community-based offer. And as I said, you know, the drive and the development of our family hubs will provide a really good multidisciplinary environment where they'll be accessing health, adult-facing services, families will be accessing those. And I think that that will offer a really good, flexible locality offer for families. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Catherine.
Hi, I had two questions. One of them was where are they going to work? So thank you for answering that. What, in terms of this being an offer, one of the SEN and Inclusion navigators mentions an SLA between the local authority and the schools. What's the kind of format of that, and how will this offer kind of, how will we opt in or out or to aspects of this?
Yeah, really good question. Again, in terms of accessibility, I would want to have that conversation as part of our co-design workshop so that we get the pathway of access right. We've got many schools that have some of those complex issues that I outlined. We do have a really detailed intelligence framework on schools that have highest concentration and prevalence of need. And we do want to be able to provide that wraparound care and support to those schools. But we also recognise that there's other schools that are showing emerging need that we also want to, we're thinking about that early help offer. I think one of the things that will be really vital about this is we want it to be a collaborative partnership. And the service level agreement or partnership agreements is really just setting out what you expect from us in terms of those roles to deliver and what we can expect from you. And one of those things within the agreement may be around some space on certain days, or it could be around the types of children that you would like for us to work with, or equally, it could be how that navigator is going to be integrated into your school community. One of the ethos is about the culture of integration and assimilation. We wouldn't want our navigators to be seen as a kind of add-on, but actually part of your school community. That is vital in terms of how they are going to work with parents and how we're going to build trust with children and young people as well. So I think it's a partnership agreement to almost have a memorandum of understanding. This is what we expect from you, and this is what you expect from us. And we are going to work together, hand and glove together, to be able to deliver on this. And I think it gives schools an assurance of what they can expect from us right from the beginning. And through the reviews, it's whether or not, you know, we're able to track that progress, or we might have to modify it and change that. So it's really about setting out that partnership, collaboration and joint partnership right from the start.
Okay. It's only mentioned on that particular role.
Yeah, it should actually say across all of them.
Yeah.
It's not just in regards to that one.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks ever so much. So I think what you're saying there is the SLA is about working practices and cementing those rather than a financial one.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly right, Chair.
Yeah. Sandra.
Hi there, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it looks really positive, and it's brilliant to see that there's a little more strategic thinking, longer term planning, you know, coming from the central team. So thank you for that outline. I suppose I'm interested to know a little bit more about its origins in terms of, you know, the modelling that will have been involved, you know, around this strategy that you're talking about. What are the cost implications? We're a local authority, not uniquely in significant deficit. There's got to be that transition period where costs remain very, very high, certainly from the high needs funding block. With this being introduced, are we going to see further expenditure required to get it up and running? And to what extent is that, what does the risk look like with that respect? So 2 parts, the risk involved, but also what's the origins of this plan? Because it looks brilliant and I'm really encouraged by it.
Yeah, I mean, what one would you want me to answer first, Sandra? I think, in terms of costs, cost modelling, I'd like to come back with a bit more detail on that, if I may. But the ethos and the plan is we do have an education inclusion team already in existence that have relationships with schools. So we are looking at maximising and repurposing our resource to be able to deliver this model. So I think that's the first thing. And we need to then consider what some of the surplus investment may be as time goes on. We really want to take an impact evaluation approach with this as well as part of our methodology, because we want to be able to analyse impact at a micro school level, but also individuals. Are we having an impact on improving outcomes for children and young people, which is of critical importance to us? So I think as time goes on, we will be able to evaluate that impact. So the first part is going to be obviously resourced by our own resourcing, and we're looking at the reshaping of that as well. In terms of the origins of the offer, I think, are you talking about research, evidence base around that? And I think that's a really good question. I think everything that we've certainly heard over the last sort of 10 to 20 years is about early help, prevention of care. And we've seen a growth in a diversity of models, whether it's multi-systemic therapy, whether it's early help, family support workers. We've also seen, models in our own trust, Circle to Success, that was delivered in partnership with Empower. And we've also seen a number of models that have looked at early help navigators in schools. This is not a new model as such. What the creativity and innovation is that we've brought strands of really effective practice into one offer. So what we've now produced is actually, we know that early help navigators and early help workers work brilliantly. We also know that SEND and inclusion navigators work brilliantly. We also know that having therapeutic support flexibly in the home and in the community work brilliantly. We also know that having training for schools works brilliantly. So we've brought them, encompassed them under one roof. So I think what we've essentially created is we've researched strands that work really well across the system, and we've harnessed them to create a centre of excellence around early help and inclusion. But I can send you some more detailed kind of research that I've looked at both in the UK and internationally that have really articulated the impact. And I also came from another borough, which was Islington, where a lot of this wraparound flexible therapy was introduced, and we had a significant engagement rate because actually we know that sometimes conventional approaches are not always as effective as flexible ones. So that's some of the origins around research and evidence base, but also recognising where good practice is.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Anything further? I just saw from Andrew on the chat, he's had to send apologies and disappear, but he talked about how positive it is to see a kind of model and something that's quite different. And I would certainly echo that as well. I think it is great to see a strategic approach to improving provision at the forefront. And then, of course, there's a huge amount of work in how you make sure that you have actually the resources to deliver that. But I think it's probably the right way round to do it, where you've actually got what's the provision we want in the forefront of your mind as the council. So thank you ever so much for presenting that. So I shall move on to, go backwards actually as it is, to item number 5, which is national funding formula. And obviously the reason for doing it this way round is there is then a vote on a transfer to the high needs block at the end of that, which has some relevance to the presentation that Charisse given, and it may be that officers want to talk in a little bit more detail about exactly how that transfer will be used to pump prime or part fund that new approach. But for this, in the first instance, I'll hand over to Yoki for item number 5.
I'm going to pretend to be Yoki and lead on this item and call in my finance colleagues' support as and when I need it. So thank you, Chair. So you'll have received the very detailed paperwork and was also shared as part of the pack, an even more detailed presentation just to outline some of the nuts and bolts of the funding formula as it stands this year and some of the changes that have been made since last year. What I propose to do in terms of presentation of this item is actually not cover that in detail, but we can take questions on any of the detail. And again, I'll look to my finance colleagues to help me in answering some of that, but move probably through to the kind of the hub of the conversation that I think we want to spend time talking about, which is in relation to the proposed transfer. So I'm going to ask Raj, if it's okay, Raj, if you can share the presentation. And what this will do is it will just pull out some of the pertinent points, which I think and I hope as school leaders you will find it helpful to see. I think I will say, as Raj gets that presentation ready, we have within the presentation that Raj is going to show, we've had the results of the consultation. And I would say, just in relation to the consultation, I know we are going to talk about it further in item 11 later, but we are mindful that it was only a week long. So thank you to everybody that did contribute. Mindful that some may have not been able to within that timescale because of the lateness of the release of the national funding formula and the date of today's meeting. It was as long as we could physically make it, but ideally we would not want to be in the position of having only a week's consultation period. But we are where we are, and hopeful that next year the DFE will release that modelling earlier for us, that we can have a longer time to think on that. Have you got it, Raj?
Sorry, Fran, which presentation is this? What national funding formula?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just
It's called item 7, proposed draft NNC. I don't know if you got it, Salik. If
Yeah, I can share. Yeah,
yeah, so
thank you.
You share, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so in the next few slides, and it's very brief because I'm hoping to leave time for more conversation, we're just proposing to take you through the options that we're proposing in relation to the block transfer. So next slide, please, Salik. So as you'll be aware, it's Forum's role to vote on whether to transfer 0.5%. You have the ability to transfer up to 0.5% from the schools block into the high needs block, and anything further than that we would need to go to the Secretary of State for approval for, or if you were to not agree, we would also need to go to the Secretary of State in order to make that disapplication request. So we just wanted to model, and this was the question in the consultation in terms of to transfer or not to transfer, the implications for what that looks like. So you see on the screen here, and this detail is in your pack as well, the difference between last year's schools block and this year's schools block. And I would just say that all schools are financially better off this year than they were last year, which is good news. So there is more money in the pot this year, and that after any scaling or any transfer, that remains the same. So that's the good thing to start with. One of the other things that we are going to ask you to decide or to consider today is the percentage of MFG that is included within the model. So we can talk that through as well. But you can see here just the comparison from last year to this year. You can see here the two options that we're presenting. So the first option, over and above the general benefit that all schools gain from this year's modelling, 90 schools gain further. we're proposing 0% transfer, 0% MFG, which is the highest level that we can keep it at. 0.5 minus 0.5% Yoki, I think, is the other option that we can have, but we're choosing to essentially hold that at 0%, which is releasing the most money possible back into schools. With 0% capping and 25% scaling, and that's the local authority's role in order to set that scaling and capping level. So you can see the options are to transfer. So essentially we're talking about that 0.5% transfer is around £1.5 million that would come out of schools block and into the high needs block. If you chose not to do that, it would stay then within the schools block, and it would be held in the growth fund pot. And I'm going to come back to the growth fund pot in a minute, if that's okay, because I want to talk a little bit more about that growth element. But essentially what that £1.5 million transfer will do is in part fund some of the things, or most of the things, that Charisse is talking about in her last item. So when we spoke with the DfE around our funding modelling and benchmarking, they noted that historically we have not invested as our statistical neighbours have in terms of early intervention, and I know you feel that on the ground, and I was pleased with the feedback that you've just given there in terms of the direction of travel. So not only have we not done it, but we also haven't committed funding in order to do that. So what we want to do with this £0.5 million is make sure that it's dedicated towards the delivery of that early help and intervention approach when we're talking about inclusion and when we're talking about SEND. So that's kind of the mechanism by which, in answer to your question, Sandra, we can really run hard and fast in terms of everything that we're proposing, and more detail to come in the new year. In terms of the growth, again, I'm going to come into this in more detail at the next item on the agenda, but many of you in the room will have already heard me talk a lot in different forums about the growth that we're experiencing, particularly in secondary and in Kettering in all ages. It's unprecedented, and it's not just something that Northamptonshire are experiencing. It's happening across this middle band of the country. So all of our neighbouring authorities are experiencing exactly the same thing. We are every month we are receiving or welcoming between 100 and 200 children into the authority. Now that's significant. So that's every month the admissions team have to find a new school place for between 100 and 200 children, and that's in the context of large housing developments and in the context of very, very few places left in the secondary provision and in Kettering in primary as well. So what this growth fund, what the growth fund pot here will enable us to do is make sure that we have a healthy ability to fund schools accordingly into next financial year and next academic year, where we need to negotiate growth. Now, I know a number of you in the room are already in conversations with us about this, and I've also spoken or heard from somebody this morning that had an experience last year where there wasn't enough growth funding in order to appropriately fund the school in order for them to take the additional pupils that we needed to, and we do not want to be in that position. I'm a firm believer that where we are asking you to take children over and above your published admissions number, you should not be financially disincentivized by doing that. So we need to make sure that we have an appropriate growth allocation held within the schools block to allow us to do that as and when we need to do it. Just a note on the scaling, last year the budgets was scaled at 100%. So we're being so mindful, and going back to the previous conversation that we had earlier around licence deficits and more schools likely to be headed in that direct trajectory next year, we're doing everything we possibly can where we can to push as much funding back into schools. So last year we scaled at 100%. This year we're only scaling at 25%, and that's to make sure that we can withhold that growth pot, which essentially will come back to schools that need it eventually as well. So next slide, please, Salik. So what we wanted to make sure that we did in conversation with the chair throughout the last few weeks was that you can see from the modelling of those two options, when we don't do the block transfer, the money simply stays in the schools block. And what that doesn't show you in order to make an informed decision is what would happen if it was distributed amongst the schools. So that 1.5 million, what would happen if it was distributed amongst the schools? So this slide simply just simply highlights what would happen. So if we do retain, or if we do transfer that 0.5% block, 90 schools stand to gain. If we didn't, a further 6 schools would stand to gain. So there's a difference for 6 schools in whether we transfer or not. There's a difference in the amounts for all schools, but in terms of the gainers and the losers, it's horrible to talk about it in that context, but that's the language that we use. A further 6 schools would stand to gain. So we just wanted to make sure that you had sight of this in order to make that informed decision. So in terms of the consultation responses, next slide, please, Alec. Being mindful heavily of what I said at the start, that we only had a week out to consultation. We had 15 respondees during that time, and 60% voted yes to the transfer, and 40% voted no to the transfer. And then the next slide, please, Alec. Oh, is that me? I've not moved on. Sorry. So I think whilst it's a limited consultation, there is a consensus that to transfer, given everything that Charisse has outlined as well, which is obviously not information that schools had when they completed the consultation, there seems to be a consensus to transfer, but we'd really like to discuss that further. So next slide, please, Salik, kind of comes back to the points that are in bold on the paper that you'll have received in terms of the decisions in principle that we require from you. And that's important to note that this is a decision in principle. This allows us, once the final figures are issued, probably on Christmas Eve, to set budgets in order to bring them back in the January forum for formal agreement and voting. But this is a decision in principle. So firstly, whether you agree to transfer the 0.5%. Secondly, in terms of that minimum funding guarantee that I mentioned, we're setting it at 0%, which is the maximum we are allowed to do, and increases and then all increases in gains are capped at 0%, which, as I said, it's the way that we can deliver most money back into schools. We're scaling at 25%, which is, as said, last year we scaled at 100%, so it's far more beneficial to schools this year. And then finally, do you agree to allocate the remaining budget to Growth Fund to enable us to fund schools appropriately as the year goes on? When we come to the next item on the agenda, I will talk about that in a little bit more detail in terms of what we already know we're going to need to do next year, and then what we anticipate the additional pressures might be. So I will stop there and very happy to take questions, any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Fran, and thanks so much for the work that all officers have done on that. As probably Fran alluded to, we had a bit of back and forth to make sure that we've got some of the right models and real transparency of the offering. Just before I hand over to everybody else, one thing that just struck me is that if that transfer of 1.5 million goes to prime the new vision, or to fund that kind of kickstart that vision, is there a way of it being reported back to Forum exactly how that money is being used as a slightly separate line? Because I know one of the things that Forum have expressed previously is a concern that actually a transfer just makes a massive number slightly less massive. Whereas actually, I think if Forums and school feels like, well, actually, this is what you're getting for the transfer, there's something a bit more powerful to that.
I mean, I'm looking at finance colleagues for confirmation, but in future high needs block reports, there's no reason why we can't provide more detail in terms of how that 1.5 million is spent. And then it's kind of it's the business case, it's the investor save business case essentially for Charisse's vision and the improvements that we would hope to see in rates of exclusions, rates of suspensions, and as well as numbers of children and young people necessitating an EHCP where we might be able to support them at an earlier point. So I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Rob.
Thanks, James. Thank you, Fran. Thank you to the finance team for putting that together. It was a very detailed and interesting agenda item and pack. I've got a number of questions, but I'm going to start with one first. It's clear in the paper that you put out, it says, should the schools forum decide not to agree to the transfer from the schools block, the high needs block, the disapplication would continue, request would continue for 0.5% to be transferred across. Can I just check that with you? Because if that's option 2, you've increased your growth fund from 3.9 to 5.4. So if that is the case, are you asking for option 2 to be 5.4? And then, as the paper says there, you're then also going to continue on with a 0.5% disapplication request?
So I asked the exact same question, Rob, of my finance colleagues. If we were successful within the disapplication request, we would revert back to the growth fund element in option 1. So that 5 point something million would revert back to the 3 point something. So we wouldn't be taking it twice, essentially. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I've got other questions, but I'm happy to hear everybody else's first, and I'll come back to my other questions if time allows.
Sorry, I think I must have been muted. Apologies. So Sandra next, please. Thanks.
Oh, you're muted,
Sandra, you've done the same thing. Sorry, you're muted too.
Zoom's gagging you, Sandra.
Yeah, let me come back to Sandra if we go to Marie.
Thank you, James. Hopefully I'm working. Yes, thanks, Fran. It was just really a question about the growth fund and the sort of the mechanisms and the timelines for that. Is it something that's only available to schools for a new cohort in September? Is there a formal application form that schools should fill out with an associated timeline? And how do the admissions team want schools to deal with the influx of in-year admissions, particularly post-census day, when our funding and our classes are set? Is there going to be a mechanism for that with kind of the numbers that you're talking about? It's inevitable that won't just be a September issue.
No. I'm glad you asked that, Marie. I was going to cover it in the next item, but I'm very happy to respond now. So feedback that we've received is that the growth fund allocation mechanism previously is perhaps not as transparent or peer reviewed by head teachers as it could be. So what I've asked the team to, Marsha's in the room, to devise, which they already have, ready for following forum's agreement to the next item, to discuss with head teachers, is a mechanism whereby we can have a governance process around the agreement of growth fund, which includes head teachers. So previous experience of a panel whereby, as you rightly say, there was an application form, and schools that felt they had hit a trigger whereby they would need or require growth funding, there was ability through the place planning officers for them to make the application. The application went to a panel which included a rotation of head teachers, and the panel made a decision. So we're intending to implement that process here. The only scenarios where a school's growth fund allocation wouldn't go through that process would be where we as a local authority come to you and say, Marie, I need you to take another form of entry, please. And you kindly agreed. And we wouldn't then make you make an application back to us for growth funding, because we are saying there's a need for growth. What we would do in that agreement is outline what the growth funding allocation would be. Your second point there around the nature of the growth. So oftentimes our growth is planned. We can see it in our trajectory. We know that it's from a particular housing development, and we can see that we can plan. So at this point in the year, and we are doing some of that now. We're working with a number of you in the room to say, we know we need you to do this for September, please, and we can make those arrangements. We also, in many instances, know that those 30 extra children are going to arrive by day 1. They're all on your school roll by census date. Happy days. What we're experiencing at the moment is, as I've shared, an influx in children throughout the year. So what that means, and a number of heads have raised with me as being a point of anxiety, is what happens even if you agree to take a bulge class and we allocate the growth fund, what happens if they're not all with you on census date? What happens if you've made that commitment to recruit another teacher to follow those children through your year groups, and yet not all of those children are there on census date? So what we've discussed is that commitment for that growth funding to essentially continue until those children are on your that bulge is full and on that school roll. And we're having conversations with specific schools around that, where we are what we want to do is strategically invest in certain schools in order to try and plan where we can for the levels of migration that we're experiencing. So Kettering is a good example. In primary sector, we have everyday applications coming in for children in Kettering. At the moment, we're going to all Kettering primary heads, depending on where the children lives, to say, please could you take this child, please could you take this child, very often over pan. And what we want to do in a much more strategic way is invest in an additional bulge years in one school in Kettering, agree the growth funding allocation for that school, and then all children be admitted a place at the school with places as appropriate. So we're trying to make it more strategic as well as more transparent. Place planning is a dark art. It's not an exact science. So best laid plans are often scuppered by changes in population behaviour that we often can't predict. But we're definitely on a trajectory of improvement about making sure that we can be more transparent, including our feedback to this forum around how monies are spent. So one of the rationales for having that growth pot is to make sure that we have enough money where we can at any point in the year where we're seeing, I may come to you, and I hope not, Marie, but I may come to you in the spring and say, gosh, can you please? We want to make sure that we've got enough growth funding within the allocation to be able to, when I'm saying please can you, appropriately be able to fund the teachers that you will need in order to take those additional children. So your points there are absolutely kind of hit home in terms of the feedback I've received since joining. And the good news is it's easy to implement a lot of it in terms of the governance and the transparency, the process that we haven't had historically. So all of that will be in place in the new year. And anybody that would love to volunteer to be on our growth fund panel, we would love to have you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fran. There's a note in the chat from Sandra. I think Mike's having issues, but the question aligned with Marie. So I think that's the responses suffice there. Thanks so much. Paul.
Thanks, James. Looking at the numbers, if I'm reading them right, it seems like a lose-lose situation for schools. When we look at the increase in funding and rolled into the national funding formula all the additional grants that go in, and baseline it against this year with the additional grants versus the New Year's funding, there looks like there's, and Fran, you or Yoki might be able to confirm this or not, it looks like there's about no more than about 1.5% increase in funding for next year in real terms with all the grants rolled in. So if that's right, we transfer 0.5% out, that leaves essentially 1% for real terms increasing funding. And we know that, I know union colleagues aren't this happy about it, but we know that the proposals going to the strategic pay review panel are 2.8% pay increase. So we've already got a cut in funding, somewhere around about 1.5% to 2%. So I actually support the move to the high needs block, but what I do find is that whether we did that or not, just moving money into the growth fund is not solving any kind of problem whatsoever. I think the genuine choice for forum members here is, do you want to do that 0.5% or leave it in the schools allocated out to schools, not supplement further an already increasing budget in growth fund? And I appreciate everything you said about that, but we haven't discussed the numbers in growth yet, and I know the government haven't issued just yet their allocations that they believe the growth fund will be. So we're being asked to do something without really that government allocation coming across. So my main point is I do support a 0.5% transfer, but I think that either way it's going to leave us all a lot poorer in the new year, with potential pay increases that won't be funded again, is the point I'm making.
Thank you, Paul. And I think I do just want to recognise that we're not talking about a situation that's hugely positive in terms of that. We know that, don't we, nationally, in terms of the levels of increase, or as you rightly say, after teacher pay awards, you know, levels of in real terms decrease. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think that's really important, and not something necessarily that is within any of our gifts to resolve. But I just think as a forum, it is important to note that and to say, you know, we're not. And I think I'm personally really, well, I have to remain optimistic and hopeful that in the new year we will hear more from central government around what does funding for children and young people with SEND look like in a new world, and if that was appropriately funded, and if we could get a different funding mechanism around that, I think we would all be sitting here feeling collectively more comfortable. So ever the optimist, I continue to hope that we will hear more in the new year from central government around that, and certainly regionally, where I'm working with other assistant directors, there is that collective feeling across the region as well, that in terms of any lobbying with the DfE or any interface with the Send Change programme, that is the conversation that's being had back to central government on all of our behalves, really, in terms of what it feels like on the ground to be running schools at the moment. So I think it's important to note.
Yeah, thanks, Fran, and thanks, Paul. I should also probably add that in some conversations with Fran and Charisse is when we move to the vote, we'll be really clear that option 1 is the preferred option, that kind of the growth fund as is, with I think it's 3.9 million in it, and the transfer to high needs, that's where we'll kind of begin with the vote, because that's actually what the NNC are asking for from Forum, and option 1 is the preferred option that they would like us to vote on, rather than the sort of increase in the growth fund. Rob, let's come back to you.
Thanks, James. Thanks very much. I'm going to build a little bit on what Paul said just there, in that in 22-23, the growth fund was about 750,000–800,000 pounds. And in 23-24, it was 2.2 million pounds. And now you're asking for 3.9 million pounds. You've outlined in your, it would have been really useful, actually, if I'm really honest, if we swap around the agendas today, it would have been useful to have the growth fund discussion before we had this discussion, actually, in my view. But anyway, what I would say to you is you've outlined about 1.7 million pounds worth of clear, already identified spending in that growth fund, but you're asking for 3.9 million pounds. So that's a difference of about 2 million quid. Now, there are, I'm sure, incredibly good reasons for that. And indeed, I'm one of the people who've had lots of conversations with NNC about this. But there's 2 points that I think we've got to be clear about now. Firstly, 2.2 million pounds, 2.2 million pounds is a huge amount of money. It means that schools on list, on average, when we look at the actual Appendix C, under the current arrangements with what you're asking, and it didn't really matter whether we vote for option 1 or option 2, because they're the same amount that are going to come from that 5.4 million pounds. It just depends whether you agree it's going to go in the high needs block plus a smaller amount for growth fund, or just growth fund. So it was the same amount, really, which again, you know, it's tricky when you're voting for the same amount, whether you vote for option 1 or option 2. But
Rob, sorry, that's the point I just want to stress about the vote. So the vote is going to be, do we do option 1 or do you not do option 1? Because I think that's what the local authority are asking.
Yeah, and I understand that.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you've sort of clarified that. But the point I'm making is the impact assessment upon schools has been at the moment how many schools are winners, how many schools are losers. And Paul was trying to say there that actually it's probably better to talk to schools about what percentage their budget will increase by in real terms. Now, I've done some back of the envelope calculations on these, and actually under the current arrangements that we're going to vote on, the average increase is about 1.8% under the current arrangements. And without it, it's about, if you go to the column that is sort of not subject to the 5.4 million reduction, it's about schools receiving about 2.93%. So it is a considerable difference. And obviously, as Paul's just brought up, we now know that we're in the minimum ballpark of 2.8% in terms of pay increases. And I think just as a panel, we've got to be really clear here that schools may begin to struggle to pay what the nationally agreed uplifts will be without making redundancies come 25, 26. I think just people just need to be aware of what we're asking here, particularly because and for totally understandable reasons, that we've seen the growth fund really increase. So my just to get confirmation from the local authority of two things. One is, do they agree with those kind of rough idea of percentages that what we're saying to schools is on average you're going to see about a 1.8% real terms uplift? And then my second question is the paper sets out that we were going on 24-25's APT tool, or the APT, the Authority Pro Forma tool. And you've had to use that because you haven't got 25-26 yet. And you've said that there may be some changes because of that when you get that through. Now, if we vote to put everything that's additional to that through the growth fund, because it says, do schools form agree to allocate the remaining budget to growth fund to address a shortage? If that changes in a positive manner, will that just be added to growth fund, or will that be kept in the schools' budgets for schools to use? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Can I take that answer, Jane?
Please do, Yoki. Yeah.
Okay. So if the figures, the settlement comes in and it's in a positive manner, then obviously when we run the funding formula according to this one, this funding formula that's been proposed, all schools will be in a better position because the pot is bigger to start off with, and we will then redistribute it to all the schools in the same manner.
So from that, thank you, Yoki. So from that, what you're saying is the 5.4 million that you're asking for through either at this point a combination of the schools block transfer plus growth fund. What you're saying is the growth fund will not increase than that 3.9 million if the settlement is more positive under the 25-26 Authority Pro Forma tool arrangements than what you've modelled so far under the 24-25. Yeah.
Yeah, but what will change is that at the moment we've had to use the 24-25 APT tool. We have used the draft census numbers we received from our census team. However, the characteristics, i.e. of the school, i.e. all the proportions for each individual school, we have used the October 23 characteristics. When we get the APT tool next week, we will then have the updated confirmed census data from the DFE with the October 24 school characteristics that go with it. So it may be, it will vary. It all depends on these two factors. And then obviously if our settlement figure is higher, it means then, we will set the funding formula at how we've said it. We will base it on 0% MFG, cap it at 0%, and scale it back 25%. Now, the balancing figure is basically the growth fund. If more figures, more budget is available, then more will go to the school, basically.
I think, sorry, I just want to make sure I understand this. So I think the question's asking there is, we understand that if there's a transfer of 0.5% high needs, that's 0.5%. That's fine. But should the growth fund be a cash figure that we say, well, it's 3.9 million, and that's what it is? So if the APT came out with a more generous settlement, that the scaling would be adjusted so that the growth fund stays at 3.9 million rather than increases. Have I got that right, Rob?
Is that what, if you want me to adjust the scaling, then I will need to report that I'm changing the scaling. But at the moment, the funding formula is such that the scaling is at 25%. So if there's a bigger pot, say we got another million extra, for example, we will run the same funding formula based on the same scaling. But ultimately, every school will get more because we have run the formula on this, not percent MFG, not percent, not percent cap and 25% scaling. And ultimately, what comes out in the wash will be the balancing figure for the growth fund. It will be all the schools will probably increase because if the pot is bigger, but growth fund could potentially change as well slightly. But I will bring that back at the next meeting. The thing is, the funding formula is set. I can't keep changing the scaling because we have a report going out, a budget report going out on consultation, as a council, which says that our funding formula is based on 0% MFG, 0% cap and 25% scaling.
Understood. So what we're saying is if the settlement's more generous, then the amount going into the growth fund would increase.
It would increase, but also for schools will also increase.
Understood. Yeah.
As well as even the transfer to high needs block, because we're talking at 0.5% increase.
Yeah, of course.
Transfer.
Yeah, the 0.5%, I guess, is more self-explanatory because it's a percentage. It's because it's a balancing sum, isn't it? Right, the growth fund, rather than being in a particular percentage. Rob, do you want to come back on any of that?
I understand all of that. Very briefly, two things. One is that I know that schools will be hard pressed with this, but I do understand the reasons for it. I think because it's increased, the growth fund particularly is increased by such a large amount, I do think it should come back to the forum quite regularly with an understanding of how that is being spent and the impact that it's having.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think that's a really valuable suggestion. Catherine.
Yeah, just to follow on what Rob just said, the growth fund presumably, is fairly fixed once all the decisions have been made about which schools are taking additional pupils and the actual amount per pupil is there and set. So that should be something which which is reasonably fixed. And so if that fund got more money into it, where would that go? How would that be distributed? Surely we have some idea of how much we need for that. I wouldn't want there to kind of be surplus in that because we got some more, because we need what we need in terms of that based on places.
So
yeah,
I think,
do you want to talk to that, Frank? Because I suppose the question is, what happens if there's a surplus in the growth fund? Where does that go?
I can answer that. So firstly, Catherine, in an ideal world of predictable population behaviour, yes, we would know at this point in the year what we needed for September. But because we're not in that position, we don't have that confidence. And because certainly reviewing all the numbers in September, we're in a very different position than even we were 6 months ago in terms of the numbers. We're not confident that we do know. So we know what we know. We know what we know now. But the reason for the higher request is that it's likely that we're going to need more in certain places. There's lots of other moving pieces, which I won't bore you with, but for example, the delivery of Hanwood Park Secondary School, with the DfE currently undertaking their free schools review, the timing of that. So there's so many other things that we know will impact on that pot of money. If it's not spent, and I'm going to look to my finance colleagues to nod or shake if I've got this wrong, if it's not spent, it simply kind of comes down to the bottom line at the end of the financial year in terms of the wider DSG. So I can't remember who it was at the start of the meeting that asked Sarai for a breakdown of that deficit, and actually is the high needs block deficit larger, but it's been mitigated in some extent by early years. We talked about actually if it wasn't spent, it would mitigate some of the pressure in the high needs block. So that's what happens if it's not spent. And what I wonder, Chair, if we need to do moving forward, and it's always a bit dangerous to do this because, as I've said, we are in an uncertain time in terms of pupil numbers and growth, and it's not following any normal patterns that I'm aware of. It is just to be aware of where there is surplus and monitor that trend, because if we're consistently having that surplus, then we might want to add that into the conversation this time next year around, well, come on, 2 years ago we had a surplus, last year we had a surplus, we don't need as much as we're allocating. And I do caveat that with the fact that we are in unusual trending times at the moment. But yeah, I would probably recommend that that's something that we report on more regularly going through.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think that would be really useful. And as Rob suggests, I think as well, kind of having regular updates on the growth fund specifically and where that's going, I think would be really helpful too. Okay, we'll move to the vote on this. And as I said, you know, there's a huge amount of information that we've seen on both presentation and in the pack. But just to be really clear, I think it's on page 37 of the pack that although there's 3 elements to what we're being asked to kind of vote on, actually they're all interdependent. They're not 3 separate votes. It's the fact that if the proposal is to transfer 0.5% from the schools block to the high needs block. In order to achieve that, that's setting MFG at 0%, capping gains at 0%, and the scaling of 25%, with the remaining budget allocated to the growth fund. So that's a single vote, and as I say, it's set out as option 1 on page 37 of all of the documents there. So if we're happy, we'll kind of move to a vote on that. And it's a vote that's open to all forum members. So all those in favour of option 1, if you could raise your hand either virtually or in real life. And Raj, let me know when you're
Yeah,
done.
I have that. Sorry, my connection's a bit laggy, so I'll turn my camera off. But yeah, I've recorded that vote. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And any abstention, any votes against, sorry? And any abstentions?
Okay, that's
So
unanimous.
make that unanimous. Yeah, thanks very much. Great. I think we're moving now on to item 7, which is the proposed central school services block. And that's back to you again, Fran.
Thank you. Hopping around my papers here because I've got them all in the wrong order. So forgive me, I've got it as item 8, but we're talking about central services block, aren't we? So yeah. This paper is fairly standard for Schools Forum. We bring it back annually in terms of just updating Forum in terms of the shifts and the changes for the elements of the DSG that's held within the Centrals block. So Forum members will be aware that elements of our centrally delivered LA services such as admissions are funded through the Central Services block, as well as elements of school standards of effectiveness. So I think just drawing Forum's attention to tables 2 and 3 in the report, noting that our allocation this year is reduced significantly from last year in alignment with the 20% ongoing reductions that we are receiving. So what that means is, and you can see that in table 3, there is less elements that are funded from this block than there has been historically. So namely moderation, a contribution to the safeguarding board and educational entitlement are no longer funded from the central services block, and a reduced allocation towards school standards and effectiveness. And we've got another item in the agenda just talking about school standards and effectiveness. So in terms of the report, and I'm very happy to take further questions, but Forum are asked to note that ongoing reduction in this budget element, to agree to the use of the historical budget as set out in table 2, and to agree to use the available ongoing responsibilities budget as set out in Table 2, and to agree to use the contribution to combined services budget as set out in Table 3. So hopefully self-explanatory, but I'm happy to take questions, and I'm sure my finance colleagues will support if needed.
Any questions or comments on that item? Great. I'm going to ask potentially a very stupid question there. What happens if Forum doesn't agree to those three things?
I'm looking at Yoki. I think, Yoki, is this one where I don't know the answer to that question. Yoki, can you come in?
It won't go to schools. I mean, this is the Central School Services block that is spent on all schools and academies. It's for, you know, the LA services, basically. If you don't agree, then the only thing that could be would be the proportions of it, of why you don't agree. And that's more or less on the ongoing responsibilities. In terms of historic commitments, the bulk of it has to cover the premature retirement costs, all the, you know, premature retirement and costs pre-2013, you know, that's where our 20% reduction year on year is taking place at present. And obviously, if our cost is higher than, you know, our allocation by the DFE, we can make a business case to the DFE to, you know, to fix it, because, you know, if our cost is more, then our budget shouldn't really go down from the DFE. But in terms of the ongoing responsibilities, I think Schools Forum could perhaps choose to rejig, you know, the proportions of what to spend on what centrally. But again, how you spend the budget centrally, it's, you know, it's for the LA to spend it on all schools and academies, basically.
Yeah, understood. Thanks. So, I mean, essentially what you're saying is that it's for Forum to agree with the way in which you've calculated this and the breakdown, because obviously you're obliged to cover those.
It won't go to schools. It is something that will stay in LA.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, understood. Marie. I think you're muted, Marie, still.
Sorry. Question about the redundancy retirement pot. Looking at all the schools in deficit budgets and looking at the lower pupil numbers in primary school, that sounds like a perfect storm. So has any modelling been done on that? And then the second point and query I have is around there being no money available for moderation. I thought that was a statutory duty for LAs to do every 4 years. So who will that fall upon if schools are LA maintained schools?
Can I answer that? In terms of the premature retirement and you know, cost part, that is historic commitments. It's not new. It's not new redundancies. It's not new, you know, premature retirement. These are all pre-2013. So basically, all that was agreed pre-2013 comes under historical commitments. Any new ones, it doesn't fall. We don't have a pot for that, right? If a school wants to make a redundancy, you have to find it within your school budget. We haven't got the budget for it. These are all pre-2013 when we moved to the fair funding formula when the DFE introduced it.
And then just in relation to your second point, Marie, the beauty of funding is that our statutory duties don't change when the funding changes. So it would remain a statutory duty for the local authority to deliver the moderation. We would need to do that within our funding block that we retain.
So that would come out of this block somewhere, whether that be school effectiveness or wherever it comes from.
We would need to, we will need to deliver it within our set budget.
Okay, but if the school effectiveness pot is less than the cost of moderation, I don't see how that's possible.
So this isn't the only contributing pot that funds the school effectiveness service. So the general fund funds part of the team as well. So this element is just a contribution towards the wider budget that funds the school effectiveness service.
Okay.
Can I add to that, please? I know a lot of the school effectiveness at the moment have shifted over to general fund. However, you know, because year on year, whenever the 20% reduction has kicked in, we have gone to general fund and asked for additional funding. However, the council cannot continue funding, you know, this top up constantly. If we think we need further, you know, services, it may be Schools Forum need to consider, you know, creating a, you know, a contribution to education functions pot, which we can, as a Schools Forum, decide that when the DFE, when the government got rid of the school improvement monitoring brokering grant, it did say that we can, you know, additionally come, you know, ask Schools Forum if we want to, you know, increase our contribution for, you know, for school effectiveness, basically. But obviously we haven't done that today.
Yeah.
So can I just clarify, are we saying all those things in table 3 will still happen and be funded at the current rate, just from a different pot?
Everything that's in table 3 at the moment will happen, and it will be funded from a different pot, yes. Because we put in, what we've put in is we've put in a medium-term financial plan request to the general fund to meet it.
Okay,
It's
so
the
20%
contribution
year-on-year
from this
reduction.
fund.
Pardon?
Yeah, I think that's right for the clarification. It's the contribution to those services from this particular fund.
And just
Not to say they won't happen.
And just to further that, and in relation to the point Yoki's just made there, going back to the last item on the agenda, that the transfer of the money, school effectiveness will absolutely be one of the services that we will be looking at as part of the wider local authority services in order to wrap around schools in the approach that Sharice has just mentioned. So we will, you've just agreed almost to also contribute to the delivery of things differently through that block transfer as well.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll move to a vote on this. And again, there's, I think you can see 6.2, 6.3, 6.4 on page 82 of the pack. But Raj will tell me if this is appropriate, or someone will, I hope, I'm proposing that we vote on that as 3 things, because obviously they're contingent on one another again, because of the way in which they've split that budget. Does that sound reasonable, Raj?
I think I'd have to defer that to officers. What do we think on that proposal? Yeah, I think that I see Yoki's shaking heads. I think that would work.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so the vote is those points 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, agreeing the use of the historical commitment budget, agreeing the use of the available ongoing responsibilities budget, and the contribution to combined services budget as set out in the relevant tables. Again, a vote open to all forum members. So all those in agreement, please raise your hand either virtually or in real life.
Okay, yeah, I have that.
Any votes against? And any abstentions? Right, thank you. Unanimous again. Perfect, thanks. And then I think now we're on the growth fund. Fran, back to you.
Thank you. So we've obviously already spoken about this aspect quite a bit. So I'll move quickly through the paper, and happy to take further questions. Key points to note, you've got there in the beginning of the report, the current allocations. We are not proposing to change those into next financial year in terms of the funding model. I would suggest that we may want to look at that this time next year, given what we've said about rising teachers' pay and things like that. I would propose that that is something that we do for 26-27, but we're not proposing to change that this year. In terms of the expenditure to date, we've got a table within the report that gives an overview of the expenditure in primary and secondary in each of the planning areas. I would just want to note, as a point of clarification, that in the Wellingborough primary allocated pot, there is a sum of money in there that was miscoded and needs to be moved to the high needs block. That was a sum of money that was for special school growth. So that was inaccurately miscoded this year, but because it's being coded, we've included it in this amount, but that will be moved back into the high needs block. So there isn't actually a large amount of growth in Wellingborough, as we know, in the primary sector. So I just wanted to note that for clarification. When we're talking about projected numbers on point 4 of the report, this is to the points that have already been made most recently by Catherine around what we know now needs to grow. And many of you in the room have been knee deep in discussions with us around growth from a capital perspective, as well as a growth fund perspective. So this just outlines what we know at this point, but things are changing on a weekly basis in terms of the incoming migration, as well as the speed at which the housing developments are moving or not moving. So this speaks to the point earlier around the known spend, but needing that additional amount in order to account for and be able to fund schools appropriately as and when we need them to grow any time in the next year onwards, essentially. And I think that is the end of the report. So forum members are asked to note, and absolutely happy to take any further questions.
Thanks, Fran. Rob, over to you, please.
Thanks, James. Couple of things. One is, do we think that the 2.269 million budget for 24-25 will be fully spent?
We do have forecasts further than is currently spent, but Rob, we can bring back in January, if that's helpful, that full forecast. And as we spoke in the last point, the clarification around what happens if it is underspent and where that goes.
Yeah, that's
happy
perfect.
to do that.
Thank you. And then the second question was around table 4. Table on 4.1, which obviously shows a lot of growth in secondary. I think the Kettering one isn't quite great. It's 220 rather than 2,200. I hope for your sake it's not 2,208, but obviously 440 places there over the 25-26 period, and then 210, so sort of less than half in terms of the primary, and that's mainly for Kettering, which you've already spoken about. A couple of things. Obviously, we've just voted through quite a very large, to be fair, growth fund in for 25-26. Of which most of it, if I'm really honest, and I'm a CEO of a trust that's a mixed trust, but we have to be factual about this. Most of it looks like it's going to go to secondary schools rather than primary schools. So I think it's just worth putting on record there, isn't it? Whether we've just voted a lot of money, and most of that appears to be going across to secondary schools rather than primary schools, who many of my colleagues, and I'm here under the Schools Forum banner rather than just in my own trust, but many colleagues who are primary colleagues would say the secondary schools already receive better quality funding and higher rates of funding than primary anyway. So I'm just making that point without trying to labour it. So thanks.
Really good point, Rob. Thank you.
Thanks. Paul.
Thanks, James. I think echoing Rob's point, actually, on there was the 2,200 in there, which I picked up, but it's also, I think, Fran, you're happy to come back on this with the next forums meeting, because it is a big jump from the 2.2 to 3.9. It's almost equivalent to another 0.5% coming off the main budget, the distributable budget. So I think having a more detailed understanding for forum members of exactly how that money is where that need is, and matching funding against the need in the areas, and probably in a bit more granularity, will be very helpful, because it is a very, very big increase on top of other big increases. And I feel at the moment we've been asked to take another almost 0.5% of budget out in terms of the increase between the 2.2 and the 3.9, without really having that visibility on it. We've done it, we voted on it, but I think we need much more detail in the next set of papers.
Happy to bring that back, Paul, definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks. Catherine.
I appreciate what Rob was saying about the difficulties, particularly in some of the primary schools. But obviously the growth funding money isn't a thank you very much to schools, secondary schools for taking some extra students. It's in order to be able to pay a teacher or or build a classroom or do whatever. We're running equally kind of tight scenarios where we haven't got members of staff sat around doing nothing waiting for these extra kids, so that money goes directly towards paying for that. So yeah, I appreciate it is coming to secondary schools, but that looks like where the numbers are coming. So it's not a kind of a thank you very much that we can put in use for anything else.
Yeah, I know Rob will totally appreciate that. There are a number of leaders from Mats with both secondaries and primaries that I know he appreciates that secondaries have those pressures as well, because everybody has funding pressures in different ways. Marie.
Thank you, Joe. Just a quick point. My school's not growing as far as I'm aware, so I think that's an error as well. In 4.4.
I will get that amended, Marie. Apologies.
Thanks, Marie. That might have been a shock seeing that on the paperwork.
Surprise.
No, it's great. Thanks ever so much. We'll close that item and move on to item number 9, which is a de-delegation item regarding trade union facilities time. And yeah, this is over to Fran again.
Thank you. So forum members will be aware of the long-standing arrangements to de-delegate trade union facilities time for maintained schools, and this paper does just speak to maintained schools, although I would like to take the opportunity to reference some thoughts we're having around academies as well. So the paper outlines the legal context and then notes the arrangement for this financial year, namely the per pupil funding of 3.79. What the proposal that we are bringing, trade unions have asked us to bring this time around, is to increase that sum per pupil by 5.5% in order to give the rate per pupil at £4. This is simply just in line with the inflationary pay that will be related to the members of staff that will be undertaking the facilities time activity. So that's the main element that forum members are asked to provide a view on, either whether to leave it at the current rate or to increase it in line with inflation. I would note that we have a current survey live with all academy heads to seek views from them as to whether academies would appreciate, be interested in the same arrangements being facilitated by the local authority as maintained schools have afforded to them, i.e. a pooled arrangement whereby academies essentially buy a traded offer by the local authority to access that, and whether the rates we would be aiming to maintain the rates to be in line with that's for that of a maintained school. So I did think it was important to mention that, because whatever we agree for maintained schools, it would be likely that we would mirror that should that take place for academies. Obviously, academies would not be obliged to opt in at all, but it would be there for them. It may be, and the survey that we have out at the moment asks for thoughts on this also, that we need to provide an administrative cost for the academies function, which of course we don't as part of our statutory duties in relation to maintained schools. So I just wanted to note that in case any academy forum members wanted to be part of that discussion now as well, it would be really useful in feeding into the thinking around that. But essentially the vote, I believe, Raj, is just for maintained members. and it's whether to maintain the current level of funding or to increase in line with inflation. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks ever so much. And traditionally, we've had representatives from unions and professional associations, and I can see Richard's here joining us, and we've always invited them just to say a couple of words in support of the proposal. So, Richard, I'm happy to give you the floor there.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope we don't go into a lengthy debate on such a nominal increase of 21 pence. But just firstly to say thank you to Fran, the HR team, and Yoki for entering into our supporting our conversations. We thank you for opening up the debate about allowing the academies to come in to the pot, which I think is really useful. I just want to say that as unions, we do appreciate the financial strains that schools are under. We appreciate you're funded on the birth rates that are lower in birth rates, the increase of EHCPs that we've heard of potentially doubling in the next few years. We understand those constraints. We understand that has an impact on you as head teachers and how you manage your staff and where you put them. But as we've heard, particularly with schools in deficit budgets, but we do have to be involved as unions in the reorganisation of staff, any reduction in staff hours, redundancy costs, or even TUPE consultations. So we would obviously maintain our facility time with that. I just want to spend a minute just to say, just to try and get any misconceptions. The money that's released from the de-delegated budget does not come to the unions. I'm not paid by the union. I'm paid by the local authority, and it enables the employer, whether it's your school or whatever, to reclaim funds back for facility time. So I'm a lay person. If I don't get my facility time, I go back and do my day job. But it does mean that if I do that, there are going to be delays in when you consult with us for redundancies. There are going to be delays when you consult with us when members are have disciplinaries or capabilities or absence management reviews. There will be delays because we'll have to give way to a paid officer to do that. I just want to confirm with Fran and Yoki that the proposal of 21 pence increase to £4 per person, that maintains our current facility time.
So I'm going to look to Saria, because if you're here, because you did some calculations for us, didn't you? Thank you.
It does, yeah.
So with that, there's no more to say. We'd encourage you to vote for the increase. One last thing from me is that you may or may not be aware of the employment bill currently going through the stages in Parliament. That they will be proposing a school support staff negotiating body. It will take the negotiations away from NJC for support staff and be nationally negotiated by that body in the same way as the teachers' pay is, and that will include academies, which means that actually that we won't be able to have local agreements with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Any comments or questions there? Catherine, I can see your hand up.
Just a question. I don't think this is anything, and forgive my ignorance, I don't think this is anything that certainly since I've been principal that we've kind of benefited from and used in any way. So it's very difficult for me to understand the kind of the need aspect for it, and the cost aspect. I can see it's feels a little bit like insurance that you've got to pay, but you never actually use. So I didn't know if there were other people here that could talk about the sort of the benefit of it from a positive point of view.
I think probably if you've ever had an employment the issue that's necessitated a member of a professional association attending, that may well have been funded through facilities time, although you wouldn't necessarily have known it at the time.
Okay.
Marie.
Well, I can just speak in support of it. We had a restructure a few years ago where Richard and other colleagues were available to support staff, which was very, very helpful through the process, which was unsettling and caused a lot of anxiety. And then more recently with various disciplinaries. So I am in support of it, and I am in support particularly of disciplinaries, of getting those resolved as quickly as possible for the school and the employee. And, so that staff can be in school supporting children and not taking lots of time off. So yeah, I would fully support it.
Thanks, Marie. Richard, do you want to come back on?
Yeah, thank you. With the schools and maintained schools getting their HR advice from outsourced HR providers, it is I can talk on behalf of other unions that the HR advice being given is varied across the county, and therefore the unions act as quite a constant. We have local reps that know the local arrangements. We know how the schools operate. If we didn't have this arrangement, you'll be dealing with regional officers which maybe don't have that perspective, and they'd have to wait for their diary to become free. I am concerned about the outsourcing of HR stuff, because we particularly as a union have noticed a variety of different advice given, which is not necessarily correct. But we do, the time is available to react a little bit more quickly. As I say, if you've got a member of staff that is a union rep employed by your school, then through the trade union recognition agreement and the de-delegated budget, they can be released of their normal duties to do union stuff. But actually, you as an employer can recoup those costs from the de-delegated budget. That's my understanding. Thank you.
Thanks. Anything further? This is a vote just for maintained members. And I think, again, I'm going to bow to Raj's expertise here, but I think we have to split it into primary and secondary. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, we could hold two separate votes, one for the primary members, one for the secondary members, please.
Yeah, perfect. Exactly that. Thanks, Raj. Well, again, what I'm going to propose, because I think, the preferred option there has been option number 2, which is page 93 of the pack, which is to increase the current rate of £3.79 in line with a 5.5% increase to give a new rate of £4. I think I'm going to propose that we vote on that first, because it seems rather nonsensical to vote on the £3.79 as a first thing, if that's not actually the main option being proposed. So first of all, for maintained primary members of Forum, so it's voting on the proposal to increase the current rate of £3.79 in line with the teacher pay settlement to give a new rate of £4 per person. All those in favour, please, if you could raise your hands.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thanks. Any votes against? And any abstentions? I think, Marie, you make that unanimous.
Yeah.
And the same question for secondary maintained sector, to increase the current rate in line with the 5.5 teachers pay settlement for a new rate of £4 per person. Votes in favour, please. Votes against. And abstentions. Thanks, Catherine. And I guess I shall leave it to officers in terms of what happens next in terms of that, but that may not be probably for this meeting. Hi, Richard.
Yeah, just one more question. Obviously, the people representing the primary and secondary heads consult with their colleagues on this. I suppose the question is, has that happened?
So I think in terms of there is one single maintained secondary school in Northamptonshire.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks ever so much, everyone. We'll move on to the next item, which is number 10, which is de-delegation in terms of school effectiveness. And Fran, it's your grand finale.
Finally, thank you all for being patient with my many reports. So finalising the agenda is around the de-delegation of part funding of the school effectiveness service, and this speaks to the conversation we were having earlier around the different pots of money essentially that build up the wider budget for the school effectiveness team. And the paper outlines a bit of a review of the impact over the last year. As James has just mentioned, we have one secondary maintained school and the rest are primary maintained schools. And this is a team that works primarily, almost exclusively, with our local authority maintained schools. So you've got an overview in the paper of what the activity's been and the impact. The paper is seeking a simple inflationary increase in the de-delegated amount, which would bring that to £13.48 in line with the teachers' pay. So that's the same inflationary increase that we've just spoken about in relation to the trade union facilities time. If we were to apply that 5.5% increase, that would equate to a budget of £110,341, and we are asking for Forum to, I believe, vote. This is a vote on whether they would be happy with this increase. And I think this is probably another one that is just the maintained schools that vote. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's similar to the last vote. I think it's split into primary and then secondary. Any questions or comments on this item? Marie.
Thank you, James. Yeah, I have a question. I can't really remember when it was. A couple of years ago, the local authority hosted a meeting at my school, actually, around the white paper when it was on the agenda that all schools would academise. And they talked at the time about there being a tipping point with local authority maintained schools funding the school effectiveness versus not being able to fund that. How far on are we in terms of that tipping point being nearly reached? Because I suppose it worries me for the local authority schools whose numbers are dwindling. And we've just said, you know, one budget pot is being cut significantly. What kind of support can those schools continue to expect and for how long? Because there must become a point where that isn't sustainable.
So you're absolutely right, Marie. 2.5 years ago, the white paper definitely outlined the then government's approach to a path towards academisation for all schools. That now isn't a current talking point, as we know, and we are yet to hear from the new government in terms of what their position is around academisation. In the meantime, as we said previously in the meeting, the local authority statutory duties for its local authority maintained schools remain, regardless of what our budget is. They remain, and I think it probably isn't for schools to be concerned about whether there is a tipping point or not. It's more for the local authority to consider how they can dynamically and creatively make sure that we are meeting the needs of our local authority maintained schools in terms of all the support that we should be offering you. And this then links very, very much back to Sharice's presentation around how we need to be more dynamic and creative in the offers that we're proposing for schools, because actually we're speaking to our services about increasing and changing their offers, not reducing their offers in light of reduced budgets. But in order to do that, we need to think more creatively and differently. I think we have surveyed primary schools this term and secondary schools to a certain extent around what they value from the local authority in terms of school effectiveness support, whether it is that traditional school improvement, teacher appraisals, whether they would prefer that to be more aligned with the inclusion services, which so we've got a really good take on what our primary schools and our secondary schools are interested in and want from the local authority. And I think it does differ depending on whether you're a primary school or secondary school. But I guess just to give reassurance to the maintained schools, I wouldn't be speaking in the language of a tipping point in terms of a viable system. Our statutory duties are to support our local authority maintained schools. We've also got statutory duties to support all children in all schools, and we should have an offer for all children, whether they're in an academy or not, or a maintained school. So the services you receive, regardless of budgets, should be meeting those statutory duties and meeting your needs. And I'd just be really keen to introduce, I don't think she's on the call right now, but we have a new head of school effectiveness, Amanda Butler, who joined us last week. And I'd be really keen to introduce her to you in the new year through our new frameworks of head teacher meetings, because she comes with a long history of working creatively with schools, particularly around inclusion. And I think she's going to be a key member of staff going forward in kind of the next chapter of what it looks like to support both our maintained schools and our wider school partnership as well. So I hope that answers your question, Marie. And I wouldn't see there to be a tipping point. We have a duty that we need to deliver on, regardless of, and it's for us to consider how we ensure that we do that within the budgets that we have set.
Thank you.
Thanks. Catherine.
I'm really sorry if I'm not reading this right, but if it's somewhere that I can't see, how is the contribution from schools? How is that calculated? Is it based on school numbers?
I believe so, yes.
Because obviously I feel in a slightly awkward situation in obviously there is only me, and clearly I have a lot more students than the primary schools, but I don't know that I get more input than the primary schools. I am very grateful for the school effectiveness that I receive, but I don't think it's directly related to how many students I have. And in fact, many of the activities, many of the things go on are primary based just because of the nature of the collaboration that can occur. So I actually feel like in some senses, some of the time I'm getting less input, but I'm paying considerably more. So I'm not sure that's what we're voting on now, but from a budget point of view, from my perspective, I don't want to pay any more for something because I'm fundamentally think maybe the formula that it's based on isn't correct. So rather, obviously, this would be an increase. An increase in terms of inflation would seem to be fair, but obviously I haven't got an input into how the formula is created.
That's a really useful. Sorry, Con.
I was going to say, yeah, the formula is a per pupil funding because, and I guess one of the quirks of the system is that, the vote is split between primary and secondary rather than together. Maybe the thing I'd suggest is, it might be worth you talking to Fran, who's probably the right person, and then Amanda about actually what is it you would want from the school effectiveness team, because, yeah, you are correct in that, you represent 100% of the maintained secondary sector.
Thank you.
Rob.
Yeah, thank you, James. Just really briefly, I just want to say that I think the report's great. We have asked for quite some time what the actual provision is that the amounts that Maintain pay for and what impact it's having. And I think the report really, really clearly answers both of those points. So it's refreshing and pleasing to see that it does that. It's really helpful for Schools Forum members. So thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Great. So if we move to a vote, again, it's exactly the same thing as last time. It's on page 105 of the pack, 4.1, which is the proposal to increase the dedelegation for school effectiveness to £13.48 in line with the 5.5% increase in teachers' pay. So for primary maintained, those in favour, please raise their hands. That is unanimous. Thanks ever so much, Marie. And for secondary maintained sector, those in favour, please raise their hands. Votes against and abstentions. Thanks. And again, I'll leave it to officers to kind of determine what comes next in light of those votes. Thanks very much. We'll move on to item number 11, which is any other business. Nothing further. That's great. In which case, thank you ever so much, everybody, for your time. Obviously, it's the last one before the holidays, so I hope everyone has a really wonderful and relaxing Christmas. Thanks ever so much for your contributions, and look forward to seeing everyone in the new year. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
James, bye.